So thanks so much for joining today. I am excited to talk to you about my work on segregation. I'm going to talk mostly about the relationship between race and class segregation and land use policy in the United States. I wrote a book on this topic a couple of years ago called Segregation by Design, as you can see on the screen. And I'm going to walk through the arguments that I make in that book, and then at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So in order to help people understand the argument in this academic book and explain the research a little bit better, I worked with an artist to develop a comic version of the story. And what you see on the screen here is the beginning of this comic. The comic is downloadable on my website. If that is something that interests you, it's free. And I encourage you to share it with anyone who's interested. So in the comic, we have two people, Tom and Jen, who are looking for a house. And Jen is pregnant with baby Katie, who you meet at the end of the comic. And Tom and Jen are searching for a house in the city of Camden, New Jersey. They have this long list of priorities. They want a historic home that's been remodeled. They want the neighborhood to have low crime. They want good schools. They want it to be affordable. And they meet their real estate agent here on the first page of the comic, Linda, who says she's going to try to do her best to find them everything that they want. What happens is Tom and Jen are frustrated again and again at the houses that they find in Camden. And it's not because anything is wrong with any of the houses, but because they find problems with the neighborhoods. So in one instance, the school is poorly rated. In another instance, the highway noise is very apparent. In other cases, there's a lot of criminal activity. So they get frustrated. And Linda suggests that they take a look at housing outside of Camden in a nearby community called Cherry Hill. So they drive out to Cherry Hill, and immediately we can see that Cherry Hill looks very different than the neighborhoods that they were looking at in Camden. And so Tom wants to know why. Why is Camden so different from Cherry Hill? He says, is this just racism or preferences, or that some people have more money than others? Well, how would we know the answer to that? And this is part of the conversation that I have in this book. So what we know is that it's not just about preferences. Most people of color want to live in integrated neighborhoods, and yet we still see segregation patterns as the predominant form of residential patterns in the United States. In general, white Americans support a lower level of integration than do people of color. And we also know that there are a lot of negative consequences to living in a segregated neighborhood. So we know that the people who live in segregated neighborhoods most often would rather not live in a segregated neighborhood. And Linda explains that it's not enough to just ask about people's preferences or their income levels, but we really have to explore the politics behind how the neighborhoods are created. She says it isn't just about individual choices at all, but the fact that local governments institutionalized racism by building it into the design of cities themselves. And this is the story that I tell in Segregation by Design. Since the earliest days of United States urban development, local governments have influenced property values and strategically allocated benefits that the government provides for some residents and not others. For the most part, white, wealthy property owners have been privileged in this process. Local politics is, at its core, the politics of land use. And the politics of land use has been dominated by property owners. For the history of the United States, that class of people has largely been white, who have sought to enhance their wealth and control the allocation of services like public education or public safety. And through the land use process of zoning and redevelopment, the placement of highways and public infrastructure, local governments have created segregation along race and class lines. So we have to back up now and ask, how was this segregation created and how is it stuck in place? Generally speaking, early on, segregation was created in the United States in the early 1900s through private mechanisms. White residents kept people of color out of their neighborhoods using a variety of different strategies. Violence was a very effective means of keeping people of color out of white neighborhoods, and restrictive covenants were another means of maintaining exclusivity. And what you see on the screen before you is a little snippet of a restrictive covenant. A restrictive covenant is a private agreement that's written into the title of a house that says, as the owner, you will not sell your house to certain groups. And you can see in the text here that no house in this particular neighborhood would be sold to anyone other than the Caucasian race. In 1948, the Supreme Court struck down the enforceability of restrictive covenants, but the practice of writing restrictive covenants into deeds remains popular for another 20 years. We also, during this early time period of American history, saw a lot of racial steering. So real estate agents would show certain neighborhoods to certain buyers and other neighborhoods to other buyers. We know this through a variety of different academic studies called audit studies, where an agency will send a Black family and a white family into a neighborhood to look at housing. And what we've learned over time is that Black homebuyers are shown many fewer properties than white homebuyers are, and white homebuyers are very rarely shown properties in neighborhoods that are populated with people of color. What these tactics do, these procedures in the private market do, is create segregation between neighborhoods. We have some neighborhoods where people of color live and other neighborhoods where white residents live. Well, it turns out that state and local government policies can have the same consequence as these kinds of restrictive covenants. In the early 1900s, several cities established separate Black and white neighborhoods using a land use regulation procedure called zoning. And the map that you see on the screen before you is from Atlanta, Georgia. And I know it's a little hard to see, but you can notice that there's different shading on this map in different parts of town. And if you look down in the lower left-hand side, you can see what the shading means. So the R2 designation was a designation where the people of color of Atlanta would live. And that is different from the neighborhoods that are coded R1, where the residents would be presumed to be white. The Supreme Court rules this kind of racially explicit zoning unconstitutional in 1917. And what Atlanta does is maintain the exact same map with the exact same residential designations of R1 and R2, all these different letters. What they do is erase the words people of color and whites. And so what this means is that cities have in their mind in this very early period an idea of some neighborhoods being reserved for white residents with low density single family zoning, and some neighborhoods reserved for people of color with higher density and apartment complexes. Even without designating specific areas of the city that are to be inhabited by specific demographics, cities can create segregation using these land use regulations. They can specify that some parts of town will have large minimum lots. They can specify other parts of town that will be governed by historic overlays. They can put freeways or other kinds of rail tracks in certain places, hemming in particular neighborhoods and protecting others. The federal government also played a role in generating policies that entrenched segregation. In particular, the Federal Housing Administration, which was a New Deal program intended to spur construction, employment, and increase home ownership, implemented a practice that you may have heard of before. It's called redlining. What the FHA did was develop a system to evaluate the risk of lending in specific neighborhoods. They had 4 categories, from very risky to not risky at all. And they gave loans to people most predominantly in neighborhoods that were very low risk. Areas that were racially homogenous, where there were a high proportion of whites, where there were restrictive covenants in place, and lots of single-family zones, lots of single-family homes were given the highest grading by the Federal Housing Administration. And you can see here up on the screen that there was language in the FHA guidelines that linked home values and racial integration. They say that the FHA wanted protected neighborhoods that would prevent against the decline in value or desirability by preventing the infiltration of business and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. What this meant in practice is that the FHA did not provide home loans to neighborhoods that had racial or class integration. That meant that the FHA provided loans in segregated, white, wealthy neighborhoods. As the history of Atlanta that I just discussed suggests, the FHA didn't invent these standards of racial worth, but it bureaucratized them. It lent them power and prestige, and it put the weight of the federal government behind the systematic practice of racial exclusion. These federal policies were in place as suburbs exploded with population in the post-World War II period. Along with the fact that race and income are highly correlated or associated in the United States, this meant that early suburbs from the very beginning were much whiter than their neighboring cities. This would change over time. Today, there are many racially and economically diverse suburbs, but they remain places that are overwhelmingly white and privileged. So where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us with 2 different patterns of segregation in the United States. A history where neighborhoods were segregated by race and class, and more recently, whole cities divided by race and class. So I know that this history can be a little bit difficult to get your mind around, so I'm going to show you some maps that I produced for the book that might help explain what I'm talking about a little bit better. So the maps that I'm going to show you are focused on that case study that I started with in the comic between Camden and Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And what you see on the screen before you is a map of segregation in 1940 in Camden, New Jersey. What I want you to notice about this map is that there is clear segregation between neighborhoods in Camden, New Jersey. There are parts of Camden that are overwhelmingly white, and there are parts of Camden that are overwhelmingly Black. And we can see that this is the kind of segregation that existed in most cities, most large cities throughout the United States by the time of World War II. We had some neighborhoods that were very white and other neighborhoods that were predominantly people of color. Then World War II happens and suburbanization takes off. Now we're going to zoom out, and what you're going to see here is the larger metropolitan area. The colors of these maps are a little bit different in order to make the point here, but now you can see that Cherry Hill, the neighboring suburb, is located on this map as well. It's very close to Camden, but it's a separate municipality. It's its own incorporated place. What's important to notice about this map is that Cherry Hill is much whiter than Camden is overall. The demographics of Cherry Hill reflect suburban America in 1970, which is that many suburbs in America as of 1970 were predominantly populated by white Americans. But one thing I want you to notice here is that Camden in 1970 still had some neighborhoods in the two corners of that map that are overwhelmingly white. Camden is now much more heavily populated with Black residents, but there remains in 1970 some neighborhoods in Camden that are very white. This is neighborhood level segregation combined with segregation between cities, between Camden and Cherry Hill. Here we are in 2011, where Cherry Hill has diversified a little bit. There are more Black residents who live in Cherry Hill, but Camden has become much more heavily populated by Black residents. And you can see that the remaining white neighborhoods from the 1970s in Camden have gone away. This is where we're at right now. As of 2011 and continuing through 2021, the segregation patterns have basically remained sticky, so that segregation now is much more heavily explained by segregation between municipalities rather than segregation between neighborhoods within cities. And today, our land use regulations reinforce these patterns. Policies like minimum lot sizes, restrictions on density, the prohibition of building multifamily duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in certain neighborhoods maintains these kinds of segregation patterns. Growth controls, open space preservation, high cumbersome fees, review processes, many aspects of the land use process codify earlier patterns of racial and economic segregation by preventing change in the housing stock. I'm going to show you some more examples so that you really get your mind around what I'm talking about. Here's an example that is a little closer to home to people potentially watching this video. This is an example of how land use and segregation are connected. What I'm showing you here is a racial dot map showing the racial segregation between cities. So you notice here we've got East Palo Alto and Palo Alto shown on this map, and Atherton. I want you to recognize a few things here. First, I want you to see that the Black population and the Latino population is heavily concentrated in East Palo Alto and then Redwood City up here in the corner, whereas Atherton, Menlo Park, and Palo Alto are much more heavily predominantly white and Asian. Another thing that I want you to notice on this map is how spread out the dots are in Atherton. What that tells you is that the minimum lot sizes, the parcels, the houses in Atherton are bigger than the houses and the parcels are in East Palo Alto or even Palo Alto. And you may recognize this to be consistent with what you've experienced in these places. So this is the racial composition of this area. The city of East Palo Alto was historically the only community in the Bay Area that was open to Black Americans. In recent decades, it has become predominantly working class Latino households, with many families living in dense apartment buildings. And again, you can see the dense concentration of yellow dots here in East Palo Alto representing Latino households. The cities of Menlo Park and Palo Alto, which are literally adjacent to East Palo Alto, have starkly different demographics. And you can see that these communities are predominantly white and the households are much less densely concentrated. So let's take a look at what land use looks like in these places. Here's the same map, but now we're looking at a view of how land is used. You can notice here on the right-hand side of the map that East Palo Alto is filled with dense apartment blocks with very little green space and a freeway running right through it. Just south of East Palo Alto's apartment buildings lies a neighborhood in Palo Alto with no apartment buildings. Large single-family homes on big lots with lots of trees. You can see the greenery in this picture. The neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to each other in Palo Alto are wealthy and white. Similarly, in the northwest corner of this map are dense apartment buildings in East Palo Alto. And as soon as you cross the border into Menlo Park, the landscape instantly switches to single-family homes with few apartment buildings. The change in land use also signals and matches a change in demographics from heavily Latino and working class to white and wealthy on the other hand. Residents in places like Palo Alto have come to expect that their land use regulations will protect this character, will protect the way that their city looks and the way that their neighborhoods look. I'm going to show you one more piece of evidence here. This is my current city. I live in Nashville. And in this map, the dots are slightly different, but I'll tell you that the yellowy orange dots here represent Black residents, and the blue dots in this picture represent white residents. The pink dots represent Asian residents, and the Latino dots are green, but there are too few of them in this particular picture to see them. What I want you to notice here is that there is a little corner right in the center of this picture that is heavily, densely populated with orange dots. This is a very densely populated Black neighborhood. You might be wondering, what is the land use designation that leads to this dense population of Black residents? Well, I'll tell you, this is restricted income housing. So low income housing that is supported by the government. It would be possible to have low income housing sprinkled all across the city, but instead the city has placed this dense population of low income housing in this one little corner, which then generates the demographic pattern that you see here. We now know that places that were privileged in the early decades of the 20th century that are shown here on Homeowners Loan Corporation maps are the very same places that have land use policies like low density zoning. So what I'll point out to you, and you may recognize some of these neighborhoods, in these maps that you're looking at, the blue and green neighborhoods are those that are designated as being highly privileged, and the red and yellow neighborhoods are those that are riskier or are in decline. What I have now shown in my work is that the blue and green neighborhoods today, in 2024, are much more likely to have land use regulations that protect that privilege. Low density zoning, large single family lots. Whereas industrial uses, higher density development, apartment complexes, mixed use development is much more likely to be placed in these neighborhoods that were designated as risky, red and yellow transitioning neighborhoods early in the 20th century. What does all this mean? Well, in the book, I talk about the consequences of these kinds of patterns. Segregation generates inequalities between race and class groups because in a world of scarce resources, the politically powerful deny public benefits to those who are politically weaker. Segregation has meant that the benefits experienced by racial and ethnic minorities and low-income individuals have been inferior to the benefits experienced by white and wealthy residents. We can see this most clearly with the history of education, but I like to tell stories that are even more detailed here. For example, in segregated places, we have more sewer overflows. In metropolitan areas where segregation between cities persists, we see vast inequalities in everything from schools to safe streets to drinking water. The situation is not immutable, but it is difficult to address. The first step toward policy solutions is to recognize truly in our hearts that segregation is purposeful. The geography of our communities did not happen accidentally, and the people who create segregation, maintain segregation, and benefit from segregation are always going to be those who are the most opposed to undoing it. but undoing it is possible. One of the most important policy levers that we have is to make sure that every neighborhood in every community has different kinds of housing stock so that different kinds of families and different kinds of individuals can afford to live in these places, and to prevent exclusive neighborhoods and cities from remaining off limits to lower income families. Garnering support for integration requires tremendous political pressure from marginalized groups, from lower income individuals, and from their allies. This is an admittedly daunting task. However, advocacy groups, citizens organizations, and concerned policymakers can build coalitions to work toward a more just and equitable society. Of course, our future depends on their success. I'm happy to take questions now, if there are any.
Thank you, Jessica. That was very, very great. I loved your use of maps. And you said you created some of those maps for the book?
Yes, I created all of the maps that you saw today.
Well, so we'll give our participants a bit of time to enter their questions. You can go down to the bottom and tap on the Q&A section. And to start, as researchers here in Sonoma County, I know I'm wondering, and maybe a few others are wondering, what types of records and materials would we look at to find some of the insights that you have found around the nation?
So one of there are many sources of archival records that are that can help you understand the history of your community. One is that you can find out whether or not there are restrictive covenants that covered any of the houses in your neighborhood, and you can do that by finding old property records, deeds and titles from previous decades to find out whether or not restrictive covenants are written into the title. Most of the data that I use in the book come from public sources like the census, and going through detailed census records. And now, because we have the ability to see the individual level census records from the 1900s, the early 1900s, you can really understand who lived in a particular place and what kind of community we saw in the early 1900s, the middle of the 1900s, and then today. And so looking at detailed census records is a great way to learn more about your community. But I also love reading historical newspaper archives to understand who had power, what were the big issues that were being debated, how did people make the decision to decide that some parts of town were going to be zoned with higher density and other parts of town were going to maintain lower density. Another sort of piece of this story is to understand the incorporation of your community. So a city is a particular designation that is given by the state, right? The state allows a community of people to become an incorporated entity, and learning about the incorporation process of your community can be very instructive. Why did the community decide to incorporate? Why did they want to remain separate from a nearby community? Were there other nearby communities that were also incorporating? Understanding those kinds of patterns can be very illuminating.
Thank you. Yeah, that approach too of who was in power, you can definitely see that in the newspaper. So thank you for mentioning that approach you have with how you start to question those records. I'm wondering, you mentioned the minimum lot sizes, and I'm wondering if you can expand on the importance of that, minimizing how big parcels could be.
Right. So a minimum lot size. So all property basically in the United States is sort of governed by an underlying map of parcels, right? So every community is divided up into little small areas that people own. And when you buy a house that is on a parcel. There are many, many communities throughout the United States that assert that a house has to sit on a certain size parcel in order to be built or sold in that community. In generally speaking, we find that single family zones tend to have approximately 8 units per acre, so 8 parcels per acre. A very large minimum lot size might be one where you only have 2 parcels per acre. And you can look in your city zoning code to learn what is the number of units or houses that can be placed on any particular parcel in your community. So every parcel has a land use designation that's going to say what could be built on that parcel. If every parcel in your community has to be a half an acre or larger, that means that in order to purchase that house, you have to purchase the half acre parcel in addition to purchasing the house. You can immediately begin to see that that is going to create much higher housing costs than a city or a community that says you can build a house on a quarter of an acre or an eighth of an acre. If you're building a house on an eighth of an acre, you can build a smaller house. So cities can use minimum lot sizes to control the affordability and the price of housing in their community. And historically, when cities have wanted to restrict their community only to higher income residents, they make their lot sizes larger.